The fire was still smoldering when he found her. Ro Vance smelled it first, a thick, greasy scent on the wind that wasn't wood smoke. It was the smell of wrongness, the smell of things gone to ruin. He'd been chasing a stray steer near the base of Elk Mountain, sun beating down on his neck, the day normal as any other. Until that smell. He spurred his horse over the next ridge, his gut tight as a fiddle string, and that's when he saw it. Down in the draw, a homestead was burned to the ground. The roof was a collapsed skeleton. The barn was just a row of black, jagged ribs pointing at a smoke-stained sky. Even the fence posts drooped like they were weeping. This wasn't a wildfire. This was an execution. He eased his horse down the slope, rifle resting easy across his lap, eyes scanning for movement, for anything. And then he saw her, a ghost crawling through the ash. Her dress was shredded and gray with soot, her bare feet dragging behind her. Scrapes ran up her arms like angry red rivers, and her face was a mask of smoke and blood. She wasn't just crawling, she was digging. Her fingers clawed at the blackened earth like she was trying to pull something back from the grave. Ro swung down from his saddle, his boots sinking into the hot ash. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, "stop moving, you're hurt." She flinched but didn't look up. Her hands stayed pressed to the ground, as if the whole world would fly apart if she let go. He knelt beside her, the heat rising through the soles of his boots. "Are you alone here?" Her voice was the sound of broken glass. "My children." Ro froze. The words hung in the air, heavier than the smoke. She finally turned her face toward him, and his breath caught in his throat. A deep purple bruise was blooming across her jaw. Her lip was split clean through. A raw, angry burn snaked along her collarbone. She looked like she'd been through a war. "They took them," she rasped, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. His chest tightened. "Who took them?" She tried to push herself up, to stand, to fight, but her body gave out. She collapsed, a marionette with its strings cut, and he caught her just before she hit the ground. Her body was weightless, a bundle of dry grass and terror, shaking with every ragged breath. "Please," she whispered, her eyes pleading. "They took my babies." Ro looked around, his tracker's mind kicking in. The ground was a mess of ash and churned dirt, no clear tracks. But whoever did this, they couldn't be far. He scooped her into his arms, surprised at how light she was. She felt fragile enough to break. "What's your name?" he asked, swinging back into the saddle with her cradled against his chest. "Sella," she coughed, a cloud of soot leaving her lips. "Sella Monroe, my children, Reed and Ruthie, they're twins, just 8 years old." "I'll find them," Ro said, the words a promise forged in fire and ash. He urged his horse into a trot, away from the ruin. "But first we get you safe." She passed out before they were even clear of the smoke. Ro's cabin was 3 miles up the mountain, tucked away in a grove of aspens and granite. It was a one-room world he'd built with his own 2 hands. He'd built it after the war, after the long cattle drives, after the woman he thought he'd marry chose someone else. It was a place meant for one man, a place meant for solitude. He never, ever planned on sharing it. But now, he carried a broken woman across its threshold, her life a fragile thing in his arms. He laid her on his own cot, the only soft place in the entire cabin. She cried out in her sleep, small, wounded sounds that cut him deeper than any bullet ever had. He sat by her side, a wet cloth in his hand, and held it to her forehead until the trembling stopped. When she woke the next morning, her eyes were wide with fever and fear. He fed her broth from a tin cup, spoon by careful spoon. He cleaned and bandaged the burn on her arm, his hands, usually rough from leather and steel, moving with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed. She didn't say much. The trauma had stolen her words. But when he finally asked again, his voice soft as the morning light, about the men who did this, Her voice came back, and it was steady, hard as iron. "There were 3 of them," she said, staring at the log wall. "They rode in just after dark. Said they needed water." Her eyes flickered. "I told them no. My husband taught me never to trust strangers." Roe waited. He hadn't seen a man's grave. "They didn't listen. They pushed their way in, knocked me down." Her hand went to the bruise on her jaw. "They lit the barn first. Said they liked to watch things burn. And then they took Reed and Ruthie. Said a pair of healthy twins would fetch a good price back east." Roe's jaw clenched so hard he felt his teeth grind. Slavers. The lowest kind of scum on God's green earth. "I tried to fight," she whispered, her eyes finally meeting his. They were wet, but there was a fire in them. A fire that hadn't been put out. He believed her. Every word. He stood up, his decision made. "I can track them. It's what I do. You'll be safe here. I'll stock the woodpile, leave you the shotgun. I'll bring them home to you." She reached out and grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "What if they hurt them?" The question was a raw plea. "They won't," he said, his voice a low growl. "I won't let that happen." He left before the sun was even a rumor in the sky. He had his rifle, a canteen, and a promise burning a hole in his chest. A promise to a woman he'd just met, a woman who had lost everything. He would not fail her. It took him 2 full days to find a clean trail. They were clever. He'd give them that. They'd used a creek to wash away their tracks, a common trick. But Roe had tracked men through worse. He'd tracked men who thought they were ghosts. These men were just clumsy. He found their first camp. And that's where the first hint of wrongness started to creep in. He saw the small, scuffed footprints near the dead fire. The children. One of them had drawn something in the dirt, a heart, with 2 letters inside. R+R Reed and Ruthie. That made sense. But then he found something else, half buried under a pine branch. A small corn-husk doll, its yarn hair tangled and dirty. A little girl's doll. Ruthie's, maybe. But Tella had never mentioned a doll. An oversight, he told himself. She was in shock. But something else bothered him more. He circled the campsite 3 times, his eyes scanning every inch of dirt. He counted the boot prints, the horse tracks. There were tracks for 2 horses, and tracks for 2 men, not 3. Where was the 3rd man Sella spoke of? Maybe he was riding double? No, the tracks weren't deep enough. Maybe he was on foot? No, there were no lone footprints leading away from the camp. There were only 2 sets of tracks. 2 men, 2 horses, and 2 children. The story wasn't adding up. A cold knot formed in his stomach, but he pushed it down. He had a job to do. Find the children. That was all that mattered. He rode without rest, pushing his horse until its sides were slick with foam. He followed the tracks into a narrow, winding canyon, the rock walls rising up on either side like a tomb. And then he heard it. Laughter. Rough and ugly, echoing off the stone. He dismounted, tying his horse to a scrub pine, and crept forward on foot, rifle in hand. He peered over a rocky ledge. Down below, in a small clearing, was their camp. 2 men, all right. Just 2. They were passing a bottle back and forth, their faces lit by the flickering campfire. And there, tied to the wheel of a small wagon, were the children, Reed and Ruthie. They were pale and terrified, but they were alive. A wave of relief washed over him, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. But it was followed by a cold, hard rage. He didn't wait. He didn't plan. He just acted. The first man was laughing, his head thrown back, when the bullet took him in the chest. He dropped the bottle, a look of stupid surprise on his face, and crumpled to the ground. The second man scrambled for his gun, but he was too slow. Roe was already moving, a silent shadow descending into the camp. Before the man could even clear his holster, Roe's knife was in his chest. The man gasped, his eyes wide, and Roe leaned in close, his voice a whisper of death. "Why?" The man choked, blood bubbling on his lips. He tried to speak, his fingers clawing at Roe's arm. She paid us," he sputtered. "The wrong price." And then he was gone. She paid us? What in God's name did that mean? He shook his head, pushing the dying man's words away. It didn't matter. He cut the ropes binding the children and knelt in the dust before them. "Reed, Ruthie, my name is Roe. Your mother sent me." The little girl, Ruthie, just stared at him with huge, empty eyes. Then she burst into tears, silent, racking sobs that shook her whole body. But the boy, Reed, didn't cry. He just stared, not at Roe's face, but at his gun. Then he lunged forward and wrapped his small arms around Roe's neck, hugging him so tight Roe could barely breathe. It wasn't a hug of relief. It was a hug of desperation, as if he was clinging to a lifeline. The ride back was quiet, eerily quiet. The children huddled together on his horse, their small bodies trembling. Ruthie hadn't said a single word. Reed had only whispered his thanks, then fallen silent. Roe tried to talk to them, to soothe them, but their fear was a wall he couldn't seem to break through. He told himself it was the shock. Of course they were scared. They'd been through hell. But as they rode, as the miles fell away behind them, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still terribly, terribly wrong. He had rescued them. The nightmare was over. So why did it feel like it was just beginning? 3 days later, he saw his cabin. And Cella was standing on the porch, just like he knew she would be. Her bandages were gone. Her hair was braided neatly down her back. She looked stronger, heavier, like she'd been eating. She looked like a woman waiting for her family to come home. Then she saw them. "Ruthie!" she gasped, her voice breaking. She ran from the porch, her arms outstretched. The little girl slid from the saddle, but she didn't run to her mother. She hesitated. She looked back at Roe, her eyes wide with a terror he didn't understand. "Mama!" Reed shouted, his voice high and thin. He leaped from the horse and ran, but it felt forced, like he was playing a part. They collided with Cella in the tall grass, a tangle of arms and legs. She held them tight, burying her face in their hair, and Roe had to look away. It felt too private, too staged. Cella lifted her head, her face wet with tears. Her eyes found his. "You brought them back," she breathed. "I gave you my word," he said, his voice flat. He couldn't shake the dying man's words. "She paid us." She walked toward him then, her steps slow, almost cautious. Her face was still bruised, but her eyes were clear and locked on him. "I don't have much," she said, her voice trembling. "Not anymore. But if there is anything I can give you—" He should have just nodded. He should have just said, "You're welcome." But something else came out. Something that had been buried in him for years. "You already have." She frowned, confused. He took a breath, the mountain air feeling thin in his lungs. He reached up and gently brushed a smear of ash from her cheek. "You're the first thing I've loved in years." She froze. Her eyes widened. The world stopped. He dropped his hand, a cold dread washing over him. He'd said too much. He'd crossed a line. I shouldn't have said that." But then she stepped closer. She reached up, her hand trembling slightly, and pressed her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart. "Say it again," she whispered. He looked at her then, really looked. He saw the bruises, the fear, the exhaustion, but underneath it all he saw a strength that humbled him, a fire that hadn't gone out. "You're the first thing I've loved in years," he said again, his voice barely a whisper. She leaned in and kissed him. It was a soft, sure kiss, the kind of kiss that promised a new beginning. Behind them, the children were chasing each other through the grass, their laughter finally sounding real. And in that moment, Ro let himself believe. He let himself believe that the nightmare was over, that he wasn't alone anymore. He let himself believe her. It was the biggest mistake of his life. The days that followed were quiet. Too quiet. A stillness settled over the cabin, but it wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. Sela moved through the small space with a careful, deliberate grace, sweeping corners that were already clean, folding blankets that were already smooth. She was trying to build a home, or at least the image of one. Reed and Ruthie played outside, but they never strayed far from the cabin. They gathered pine cones and sticks with a solemn intensity, like children who had forgotten how to be children. Ro chopped wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound for hours on end. His hands were steady, his feet planted firmly on the earth, but his mind was a whirlwind. She paid us. The words echoed in the silence. They barely spoke. The four of them were like strangers trapped in a stagecoach, each lost in their own thoughts. But the air was changing. Kella started leaving the fire lit all day, a cheerful blaze against the growing autumn chill. Ro found himself bringing back small gifts from his rides. A handful of wild choke cherries, a pretty blue rock from the creek, a hawk's feather for Ruthie's hair. He was trying to build a bridge across the silence. One morning, as Sela stood in the doorway, he asked, "You built this place yourself?" He straightened up from the water trough. "I did." "How long ago?" 7 years. She nodded, her eyes tracing the sturdy roof beams. "It's built to last." He stepped closer. "It was meant to." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "I don't know how to be part of something that lasts." "You already are," he said, and for a moment he believed it. He wanted to believe it. That evening, Kella was patching one of his old shirts. He hadn't asked her to. "You don't have to do that," he said, leaning against the porch rail. "I know," she replied, not looking up, "but I want to." He watched her hands. They didn't tremble anymore. They were steady, capable, but there was something in her focus that felt practiced, as if she were playing a role, the role of the grateful, saved woman. He sat on the step below her. "What did you grow at your place?" "Corn," she said. "A few hens. I had a small garden." She paused. "Not much took. The soil was poor." "Ground's better here," he said, testing her. "Softer." She finally looked at him, her eyes searching his. "Are you saying you want us to stay?" "I'm saying I hope you do." Her gaze held his. "I need to know something first." He nodded. "Were you always alone out here?" "By choice at first," he admitted. "Then it just became a habit." "And now?" She pressed. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "Now I want something different." The very next morning, she asked him to teach her how to shoot. She said it plainly, without a hint of fear or apology. "I won't be helpless again," she stated, her jaw set. He didn't hesitate. He handed her the heavy rifle, showed her how to brace it against her shoulder, how to breathe out slow as she squeezed the trigger. She missed the first few shots, the kick of the gun jarring her. But then she found her rhythm. She hit the tin can he'd set on the fence post, then hit it again. A flicker of a smile touched her lips, a smile of grim satisfaction. "You were never helpless," he told her, and he meant it. But as he watched her reload the rifle with practiced efficiency, a new thought chilled him to the bone. This wasn't a woman learning a new skill. This was a woman remembering one. That night, after the children were asleep, she told him about her husband. They sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. "You don't ask many questions," she said. "I'll wait for what you want to tell me," he replied. "I was 16 when I married him," she began, her voice a low monotone. "He was a big man, twice my size. He thought kindness was a weakness. Roe remained perfectly still, his silence an invitation. He died 3 winters ago. A fever took him. She stared into the flames. I didn't mourn him. Roe said nothing. He was a stone wall, letting her words break against him. I brought the children west last spring, she continued. Thought if we had our own land, our own place, we'd finally be safe. I was wrong. You weren't wrong, he said softly. You just weren't given the time. She turned to him, her face a mask in the firelight. And you? Why are you alone? Was there no one before me? There was someone, he said, the old wound aching. But I came back from the war. Different. And she didn't wait. Was she wrong to not wait? No, he said honestly. I didn't give her a reason to. Tella reached out, her fingers just brushing the sleeve of his shirt. You're not that man anymore, the one who came back from the war. No, he agreed. I'm not. The fire crackled, filling the silence. Tella glanced at the sleeping children, then back at him. They already call this place home, she said. His eyes met hers. And you? She didn't answer with words. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. Their breath mingled. Her eyes were closed. It wasn't a kiss. It was a brand. A claim. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her head on his shoulder and he wrapped his arm around her. It should have felt right. It should have felt like coming home. But all Roe could feel was a cold, creeping dread. The cabin was warm, but a wintry chill was settling deep in his bones. He was holding a woman who was a stranger, a woman whose story had holes big enough to ride a horse through. 2 men, not 3. She paid us. A husband who died of a convenient fever. A woman who learned to shoot a rifle a little too quickly. He was in a house built on lies. And he was starting to suspect that the fire she'd escaped from was one she had set herself. The first frost came, and with it, a change. The children, who had been like silent little ghosts, began to thaw. It started with Reed. Roe was splitting logs when the boy came and stood beside him, watching the axe rise and fall. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice so quiet Roe almost missed it. My pa, he said. He used to chop wood like that. Before he got sick. Roe paused, leaning on the axe handle. Your mother said he had a fever. Reed kicked at a loose piece of bark. That's what she says. The boy's tone was flat, devoid of emotion, but the words sent a jolt through Roe. That's what she says. It wasn't a confirmation. It was a correction. Later that week, it was Ruthie. Roe was mending a piece of tack on the porch. The little girl came and sat on the steps, holding the corn-husk doll he'd found at the camp. He'd given it to her the day after they got back, and she hadn't let it out of her sight since. She was stroking its yarn hair when she spoke. Mama doesn't like this doll, she whispered, her eyes on the horizon. Why not? Roe asked, keeping his voice casual. She says it reminds her of bad things. Ruthie hugged the doll tighter. She threw it in the fire, but I guess it didn't burn. Roe's hands went still. His blood turned to ice. Sella had thrown the doll in the fire. The doll he had found miles away at a camp she was never at. The lies were starting to unravel. Sella wasn't a victim. She was something else entirely. And he was trapped on a mountain with her, playing the part of the savior while she played the part of the survivor. But what had she survived? And what had she done? He had to know. He had to be sure. The next time he rode out to check his trap lines, he took a detour. He rode back to the burned-out homestead. The place was cold and dead, the ash settled by the autumn rains. He dismounted and walked through the ruin of Sella's life. He went to the spot where the barn had been. He kicked through the charred timber and debris, searching for anything. And then he found it. Hidden beneath a collapsed section of the roof was a small, locked metal box, warped by the heat but not broken. He pried it open with the tip of his knife. Inside there weren't letters or keepsakes. There were stacks of money, more money than a poor homesteader could ever dream of seeing. And beneath the money, a man's silver ring and a small leather-bound ledger. He opened the ledger. The handwriting was neat, precise. Sellers. It wasn't a diary, it was a record of accounts, payments made, debts owed, and names. He saw two names he recognized from the local town, men known for doing dirty work for the right price. And next to their names, a sum of money, a payment, dated just 2 days before the fire. He flipped through the pages. He saw entries for supplies, for land deeds, and then he saw it. A page near the back, a different kind of entry. It listed ingredients, not for baking, for poison, belladonna, arsenic, and a date scrawled next to it. 3 years ago. The same winter she said her husband had died of a fever. The truth hit him like a physical blow. Her husband hadn't died of a fever. He'd been murdered. The fire wasn't an attack. It was a cover-up, a way to erase her past and start fresh. The two men weren't kidnappers. They were employees. She had paid them to take the children. But why? Why would a mother send her own children away with men like that? The dying man's words came back to him. She paid us. The wrong price. They must have gotten greedy. Decided the twins were worth more on the open market than what Sela had paid them. She hadn't been attacked. Her plan had just gone wrong. And Roe wasn't her savior. He was her new plan. The lonely man on the mountain, strong, capable, isolated, the perfect protector, the perfect fool. He had brought her children back to her, the very children she had tried to get rid of. He had walked right into her spiderweb, and she was slowly, patiently, wrapping him in silk. He rode back to his cabin, the ledger tucked safely in his saddlebag. The setting sun painted the sky in brutal shades of orange and red, like a fresh wound. When he got back, the cabin was filled with the warm, comforting smell of stew. Sela greeted him with a smile. The children were sitting at the table, drawing on a piece of slate. It was a perfect picture of domestic bliss, a perfect lie. He knew he couldn't confront her. Not yet. Not while the children were there. He had to get them away from her. He had to get them somewhere safe. He played his part, eating the stew, complimenting her cooking. But inside he was a coiled spring. That night, as she slept soundly beside him, he stared into the darkness, his mind racing. Who was this woman? What was she capable of? He thought of the poison in the ledger. He thought of the fire. He thought of her steady hand on the rifle. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his soul, that he and the children were in terrible danger. She hadn't just been running from her past. She had been hunting for a future. And he was it. The next morning, he told her he needed to go into town for supplies. "It's a 2-day ride," he said. "I need to stock up before the first big snow." He looked at the children. "And these two have been cooped up for too long. They could use the ride." Kella's smile was perfect. "Of course," she said. "That's a wonderful idea. I'll pack you some food." The mask didn't slip, not for a second. As he saddled the horse, Reed came up to him. The boy's face was pale. "Are we coming back?" he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "No," Roe whispered back, his hand on the boy's shoulder. "We're not coming back." The ride was tense. The children were silent, as if they knew everything hung in the balance. Roe didn't go to town. He took them to an old, abandoned trapper's shack he knew, hidden deep in a valley miles from his own cabin. It was small and drafty, but it was safe. He built a fire and sat them down. And for the first time, he asked them the question that had been haunting him. "Reed," he said, his voice gentle, "what happened to your father?" The boy looked at his sister, who gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Then he looked at Roe, and the story came tumbling out. A story of a mother who was one person in the daylight and another in the dark. A mother who would sing them lullabies one night and lock them in the cellar the next. Their father hadn't been a kind man, Reed admitted. He was hard and mean, but he hadn't been sick. One night, he and their mother had a terrible fight. The next morning, he was dead. Their mother told everyone it was a fever that took him in his sleep. She told Reed and Ruthie that their father's bad blood was in them, especially in Reed. A sickness she had to watch, a darkness she had to control. The men she hired weren't supposed to sell them. They were supposed to take them to an orphanage in the East with a bag of money to pay for their keep. A way to get rid of them for good. "She told us we were going on an adventure," Ruthie whispered, clutching her doll. "But then the men started talking about selling us. They said we'd be worth more than the money she gave them." The fire. Sela had set it herself. After the men had taken the children, she set the house and barn ablaze, a final dramatic act to sell her story. The story of a grieving, victimized mother. The story she had fed to Ro. He had not rescued a damsel in distress. He had rescued a monster's children from a deal gone wrong. Now the monster was waiting for him. In his home. Sleeping in his bed. He looked at the two small, terrified faces lit by the firelight. He had made a promise to their mother, but his true promise he now realized was to them. He would protect them, no matter what it cost. He left the children at the shack with enough food and water for a few days, and a shotgun they both knew how to use. "Don't open this door for anyone but me," he told them. "I'll be back. I promise." Then he rode back to face the woman who called herself Sela Monroe. He rode back to the spider's web. When he walked into the cabin, she was humming, stirring a pot over the stove. She turned and smiled. But the smile died on her lips when she saw he was alone. "Where are the children?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "They're safe," Ro said, closing the door behind him. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't put down his rifle. Her eyes narrowed. The mask was gone. In its place was something cold and calculating. "What have you done?" "I went back to your homestead," he said, his voice level. "Found a little metal box." Her face went blank. All expression, all emotion, wiped clean. It was more terrifying than any rage. "You had no right." "I found this too," he said, pulling the corn-husk doll from his coat pocket. He tossed it onto the table between them. "Ruthie told me an interesting story about this doll. She said you threw it in the fire." He took a step closer. "The fire you set, but I found it miles away, at the camp where your hired men were keeping your children, the children you paid them to get rid of." The silence in the cabin was absolute. The only sound was the bubbling of the stew on the stove. Sela didn't deny it. She didn't even try. Instead, she laughed. A low, chilling sound that had nothing to do with humor. "You are more clever than I thought, Ro Vance," she said. "I should have chosen a dumber man." "Why, Sela?" he asked, the question tearing out of him. "They're your children." "They are his children," she hissed, her face contorting with a sudden, violent rage. "My husband was a monster, a cruel, vicious man, and his poison is in them, especially the boy. I see his father in his eyes every single day." She leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "I was protecting the world from him. I was cleansing my life. I was starting over, and you were my new beginning. A good man, a strong man. We could have had our own children. Good children." She was completely insane. The realization settled over him, cold and heavy. This wasn't about protection. It was about her own twisted sense of purity. As she spoke, her eyes darted to the butcher knife lying on the cutting board next to the stove. He saw the flicker of movement, the tensing of her shoulders. She was going to lunge. He was ready. The man who came back from the war was slow and broken. But the man standing in this cabin now was not. He was sharp. He was focused. He was a survivor. She moved like a snake, fast and silent. But he was faster. He kicked the table, sending it crashing into her, knocking her off balance. The knife clattered to the floor. He had her pinned against the wall in a second, his forearm pressed against her throat. Her eyes were wild, filled with a black, bottomless hatred. She struggled, spitting and clawing like a trapped animal, but he held her fast. He didn't hurt her. He wouldn't become the monster she was. He just held her, waiting for the fight to drain out of her. Justice wasn't a knife in the dark. Justice was the light of day. He tied her to a chair with a length of rope. She stared at him with empty eyes, the fight gone, leaving only a hollow shell behind. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the other chair, his rifle across his lap, and watched her until the sun came up. The next morning he put her on his horse, her hands tied in front of her, and started the long ride into Laramie. He wasn't taking her to the sheriff. He was taking her to the circuit judge. He wanted to make sure the truth, all of it, came out. They were halfway to town when he saw the dust cloud on the horizon. A posse. At least a dozen riders moving fast. They reined in as they saw him, their leader, a grim-faced man with a marshal's badge pinned to his chest, raising a hand. "Hold up there, friend," the marshal called out. "We're looking for someone." Roe pulled his horse to a stop. "Who would that be?" The marshal's eyes fell on the woman tied to Roe's horse. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "We're looking for a woman named Sella Monroe." Roe's blood ran cold. This wasn't about the fire. This couldn't be. "What for?" he asked. The marshal's gaze was hard as granite. "She's wanted. For the murder of her husband 3 years back. We got a witness, a man who says he helped her do it. Says she promised him a share of the husband's money, then tried to poison him too. He's been running scared ever since, but his conscience finally got the better of him." The marshal squinted at Roe. "Looks like our hunt is over." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The third man. The man Kella had invented to make her story more believable. He was real. He was her accomplice, the partner she had betrayed. Her entire story, from beginning to end, was a web of lies, woven around an even older, darker lie. She wasn't just a mother trying to escape a bad memory. She was a cold-blooded killer who had been on the run for years. The posse took her away. She didn't look back. Her face was a blank mask, her eyes fixed on some distant point that only she could see. Roe watched them go, the dust settling around him in the quiet morning air. He had ridden out to rescue a woman from a tragedy and had found himself in the middle of a horror story. He turned his horse around and rode back to the mountains, back to the hidden shack where 2 children were waiting for him. He found them huddled together by the cold fireplace, the shotgun resting between them. When they saw him, they both burst into tears. But this time, they were tears of relief. He took them back to his cabin, his home, the place that was meant for one lonely man. He threw out the pot of stew. He scrubbed the floor. He aired out the rooms, letting the clean mountain wind blow away the last traces of her. That night, the 3 of them sat around the fire, eating jerky and dried apples. It wasn't much of a meal, but it was an honest one. He looked at Reed and Ruthie, their faces soft in the firelight, and he knew his life was no longer his own. He hadn't found the love he thought he was looking for. He had found something more important. He had found a family, a reason to build something that lasts. The quiet man on the mountain had finally, after all these years, found his way home. The scars of the past can't always be burned away. Sometimes they have to be healed by building something new. If you were captivated by this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales from the shadows.